Um, Good afternoon, and welcome everybody to today's program at the Commonwealth Club. My name is David Cohn. I'm a senior director at Advanced Local and co-founder of Subtext, which connects reporters and readers. I have spent a large part of my professional life at the intersection of technology and news, so I'm very pleased and honored today to moderate today's important program about nonprofit local news efforts, civic journalism, and the future of democracy. I'm particularly pleased that today's discussion represents one of the Commonwealth Club's first hybrid virtual panels or programs since the club reopened earlier this month. So what does that mean? Again, it means that two things. First, we have a live audience here in San Francisco. Thank you all for coming. And viewers around the country are watching via YouTube and Zoom. Second, it means we have a guest here on stage, Lance Noble, the CEO of Cityside, and two guests joining us virtually, Wendy Thomas, the editor and publisher of MLK 50, Justice Through Journalism, and John Thornton, the founder of the Texas Tribune and the co-founder of the American Journalism Project. Lance, Wendy, and John, I am pleased to welcome you to the Commonwealth Club. Before we jump in, a quick reminder about audience questions. If you are live, please fill out question cards. They will be handed to me throughout the program. And for those of you watching on YouTube or online, you can post your questions in the chat area, and those questions will also be forwarded to me during the program. To start, I'm hoping that the three of you can each, in your own words, tell us the work that you focus on and how you're filling an unmet need in our information ecosystems. I'm going to start with Lance because you're here both in person and also here in the Bay Area. So Lance, tell us a little bit more about what you do and the role that it fills.
Thanks, Dave. I run Cityside, which is the nonprofit that publishes both Berkeley Side and Oakland Side. Berkeley Side has been around for 12 years now. Oakland Side is just a little bit more than a year old. We focus on local news in the cities that we cover. And when you ask about what's the information need we fill, in both cities, we filled what was really a void of coverage. A year ago, before Oakland Side launched, for example, no one, in terms of no journalist, went to Oakland school board meetings. Now, Ashley, our education reporter on the Oakland Side, covers every school board meeting. She's writing about what's happening. We cover, obviously, city council meetings. We cover what's happening in development. We cover, key issues in terms of the inequities that exist in the city. There's no end of stories. I mean, the challenge for us is not what gaps are there, but, how with what's still a pretty small newsroom in both Oakland Side and Berkeley Side, how do we cover the enormous number of stories that exist?
Excellent. Wendy, I'm hoping you can follow up and tell us a little bit more about the MLK 50 project.
Absolutely. Thank you for this opportunity. I really appreciate it. So MLK 50 Justice Through Journalism is a nonprofit newsroom. It's based in Memphis, Tennessee, where I grew up. And the void that we fill is for substantive, sustained coverage of the people that Dr. King would be aligned with were he still alive. MLK 50 was born in the lead up to the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's assassination. And we really wanted to force people to confront what the city had done with his sacrifice as it related to the reason that brought him to Memphis, which was to support underpaid, mistreated, striking Black sanitation workers. And so we like to say that we are aligned with the people that Dr. King would be aligned with were he still alive, which are people who are marginalized for any reason, whether it's economic, race, gender identity, sexual orientation, any of those, immigration status. Those are the people that we focus on. And our mission is twofold. One is to bear witness to movement making here in Memphis, and also to report on the intersection of poverty, power, and policy.
Excellent, thank you. And John, you can tell us both a little bit about the Texas Tribune, which I know you're one of the founders of, but also, of course, what you're, I think, focusing more on now. You can tell us, but the American Journalism Project.
Sure. And thanks for having me as well. Founded the Texas Tribune in 2008, and it has been one of the great joys of my life. Founded American Journalism Project together with Elizabeth Green in 2017. And we're basically a venture capital firm that makes investments in outfits like Wendy's and Lance's.
Excellent. And so I definitely want to get into it and ask you all a bunch of questions. And by the way, I'm also hoping that you can all engage with each other. If I end up fading into the background, I'm more than happy to play the role of Ringo Starr here. But my first question is, and a lot of people in the audience probably have a sense of what's been happening in the journalism and media industry, in that it's had all kinds of problems and declines and things like that. But they might not be totally aware of exactly the role that nonprofit has been playing, nonprofit news organizations have been playing in their local role. Now, exactly what shift do you think has been happening that nonprofits have been rising up? What are the forces at play here that are both, again, either hurting what we might call traditional media, but also empowering you all to sort of try and respond to that call? I would say it's an open question if anybody wants to jump in.
I'm happy to jump in. The key dynamic is the traditional way that news, and particularly local news, was funded has vanished. The advertising revenue that supported local newspapers, subscribers that supported local newspapers, in all but a handful of cases, that support just isn't there. And you can see that in the traditional newspaper world, and even the newspapers that have made a fairly successful transition to the digital world. The excess profits that they once made that made it a really good thing to own a newspaper, they've vanished. And so many local newspapers now are owned by hedge funds, by financially motivated investors who are actually getting profits out of these newspapers. So they're getting profits by slashing newsroom numbers, by keeping subscription prices high, and there's a lot of inertia. Particularly elderly people always have subscribed to their local newspaper, and until they die off, they're going to continue subscribing to their local newspaper. So, organizations like Alden Capital are making great money off the newspapers they own, but there's very little journalism. So there's a real crisis. And when you have a situation like that, that's partly why nonprofits exist. They're providing a solution. They're providing the resources, they're providing the things that we need in terms of public goods that aren't provided by a simple market solution.
It makes a lot of sense. Although it begs a question, and maybe I'll pose this to Wendy, because the nonprofit newsrooms that are now, I don't want to say starting from scratch, but have a little bit more of a clean slate, right? How can we be intentional, right, about making sure that these newsrooms aren't just replicas of the old, right? What is different? What are you doing different, or what should be done differently about the rise of these new nonprofit local news organizations?
I think it's an excellent question. I'm a veteran of 4 daily newspaper newsrooms and been in the business for 28 years. And so a lot of the changes that Lance describes, I've lived through. The heady days where newspaper companies were making money hand over fist, it seemed, and then moving into the much leaner days. And I think what nonprofit news has given us is an opportunity to reimagine newsrooms and make them how we wished they had been when we were there. That can be everything from the racial diversity of the leadership of the newsroom to the business practices, being more humane than maybe some traditional legacy newsrooms have been. And so it's really it's a real opportunity to start fresh and say, okay, if we were building something from scratch, what would we do? What would we stop doing? I know with my team, there are some things we just don't cover, right? Because we're really focused on what we can do well and what only we will do. I always tell my team, what are the stories that only MLK 50 would write? And that's what we go after. But I think it is a challenge. And I'm grateful to funders like AJP and others who are committed to making sure that the newsrooms that are getting venture capital style kind of funds and investments do look like the majority of America. But I think if you're not intentional about that, things will just be the way they've always been. And we see where capital flows traditionally in America, and it's to cis, hetero, college educated, upper middle class white men. And this is an opportunity to do things differently. And I know Lance can talk about the leadership they have out there, thinking particularly of my friend Tasneem.
Yeah, both Oakland side and Berkeley side, their editor-in-chiefs are women of color. We have very diverse newsroom. That's been a priority for us. We want our newsrooms to look like the communities we cover, and that's really the only way we're going to reflect the experiences of the city, of the people we're reporting for and on. That's an absolute essential.
John, I don't know if you want to comment on that, but I specifically more from maybe a macro perspective, right? Because what you're working on right now, you kind of have a view into a lot of different organizations across the country. I'd be curious to know if what you're observing as they kind of rise up, and what are some of the foundational principles, and again, where those principles and practices might be different from the traditional organization that preceded them.
Sure. Well, just to sort of tack on to the discussion that my two colleagues just had, diversity is not a very good media strategy, as it turns out, in the very near term. Inclusion is not a good media strategy in the near term. Accessibility is not a good media strategy in the near term, because it has the presupposition that these things need to be commercially viable as opposed to economically sustainable. And so what we put out from the beginning at AJP is that news organizations need to have co-equal values of commercial viability, accessibility, and public service. That's just not doable in the commercial model. And so what the three of us have been after for a while is trying to square how interdependent journalism and democracy are on one another with the fact that 150 years ago, we made kind of a sucker bet as a country to put all of our sort of chips, if you will, behind advertising as the source of support for journalism.
I've never heard it put as a sucker's bet, but but that's an interesting way of putting it. And you use this phrase, and I might not get it perfectly here, but again, the interrelationship between journalism and democracy, and I think a lot of times we think of that at the federal level, at a very macro level. I'd be interested to hear about, again, within your organizations or the organizations that you're observing, what is the role between a nonprofit news organization and the local democracy and the local civics? Can you tell us a little bit about exactly what it is that you see yourselves as doing in that specific role?
Well, Wendy's work has been so inspiring in this regard. So I'd love to hear from her in terms of some of the work MLK 50 has done in accountability and investigative journalism in Memphis is really extraordinary. So I think that's almost the best case study for what this means. On to you.
Yeah, I want to hear more.
Are you thinking about the hospital work? Okay, so I want to bring into the space some words by one of my heroes, Ida B. Wells, who was a anti-lynching crusader and also an investigative journalist. And she said that the people must know before they can act, and there's no educator to compare to the press. And so I think that connection between democracy and journalism is absolutely essential. And it's one of those things where I feel like, you'll miss me when I'm gone. And I think the challenge of nonprofit news is to encourage people to recognize the value now and not wait until we've all disappeared. The project that Lance is referring to, we did in conjunction with ProPublica, which is an investigative nonprofit newsroom out of New York. And I spent a year looking into the debt collection practices of a nonprofit hospital here. Weeks and weeks in court telling the story of people, mostly Black women, who were being sued by this nonprofit hospital, including the hospital's own employees. So I'm going to court and I'm seeing women sitting there waiting for their turn in front of the judge, wearing the hospital's uniforms. And so this was a story that was kind of hiding in plain sight, right? Just going on there, right in General Sessions Court. But if you weren't being sued, you'd have no reason to know. And the only faults of these people was that they were poor and sick at the same time. Mm-hmm. And so we wrote this investigation. It published. The hospital was shamed. Shame, as it turns out, is a very powerful motivator for institutions. And they ended up overhauling their financial assistance policies to be twice as generous as they were before. They decided they were no longer going to sue their own employees at all. And they ended up erasing the debt for more than 5,300 defendants to the tune of $12 million. And so I think it's a good, there are examples of like that in lots of nonprofit newsrooms around the country. So I don't want to make it at all appear that we're unique in that way. But to me, that speaks to the power of journalism and the worth of this investment, right? It's hard to say, okay, we'll invest $200,000 in this newsroom and we expect a return of $400,000. But what we've been able to do with the support of AJP and others is change policy. So there were thousands of people in Memphis who will never be sued because of the work that we were able to do. And I don't even know how you calculate that level of impact, but I think it's the kind of work that all of us aspire to be able to do, to make a measurable, tangible difference in our communities. And I'm lucky enough to have been able to have the opportunities to do that.
And there's a lot of actually pretty good social science research on, not so much on what does local journalism do, it's what the absence of local journalism creates. And in the absence, you have lower voting rates. Cities pay higher bond rates when there's a lack of local journalism because of the lack of that kind of accountability journalism that keeps people honest and efficient. You have lower social cohesion. There are all sorts of consequences from the absence of local journalism. And that's why all of us that are involved in this really feel this enormous calling that this really matters, that local journalism isn't a nice thing to have, that every community, every city needs healthy local journalism.
No, that's sorry, John, were you going to say something? No. I think that's a really good point. I mean, it's sort of like the watchdog doesn't necessarily have to catch somebody just as long as they scare them away. And also, Wendy, to your story, there are, that affected real people. I think it's really easy to, you said, I think 5,300, right? And that sounds like a big number and it's easy to gloss over, but those are 5,300 people, individuals who their lives were materially changed by the work that you did. So one question I think you kind of have to ask in maybe in any discussion now is COVID and how the last year has changed the situation for local nonprofits in particular. What are the challenges or opportunities that have started to bubble up in, let's say, the last 12 to 18 months? Maybe John, do you want to try and respond to that?
Well, I think for us as a funder, what COVID did was just kind of brighten the light on what we already knew, which was the inequality of accessibility to pretty much damn near anything, right? So whether it's affordable housing, clean air, clean water, education, capital to run a business, it just really showed us that the crisis of inequality, which gets mumbled about, is really, really the central crisis. And so What I think this period affords us the opportunity to do is think about local news institutions as civic assets, not commercial businesses. Think about them as community cartilage, if you will, or ligaments, not a shoe store, which is what newspapers have essentially been, as a business for 150 years. So it's been really, really difficult for anybody running a newsroom, but it's also an opportunity to rethink how we think about these organizations and what they mean to their communities.
I think what we saw on both Berkeley side and Oakland side, and speaking to my colleagues around the country, what the pandemic did was made people incredibly aware of how important local information was to them. During the height of the pandemic, this was about, changes in, health recommendations. It was about, what's happening in the community in terms of prevalence levels of, positivity. And, more recently, you think earlier this year when availability of vaccines was really something that people were worried about, people didn't have the information they needed. There was an enormous desire, not just to know, there's a national rollout of these vaccines, but in my community, in my neighborhood, in my, zip code, where can I get a vaccine? And that's the kind of work that we do and that other local journalists do.
We're getting a bunch of questions from the online audience and the in-person audience. So I'm just going to start going for these. And I see a few questions around this. Is there sufficient philanthropic capital to essentially scale the number of local news organizations that we need? Again,
John's
open question, but probably John, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I know a year and a half ago, John, you told me that the amount of philanthropy devoted to journalism was less than the amount devoted to ballet in the U.S. I don't know if that's still the case, but you'll have the latest data.
Well, yeah, unless the ballet has shrunk considerably, you're still right. And so that's been our shtick for going on a dozen years is no, there is not enough philanthropic capital today to do what needs to be done. But two things. One is the place to which it needs to be grown is not that enormous. We give $400 million a year to ballet companies or dance companies in the US. We give about a quarter of that to local news organizations. And in terms of is that enough? Again, we're on the front end of trying to build a movement that's going to take a generation or more that grows the philanthropy pie a lot for journalism, because unless we think about these things as civic institutions, not commercial institutions, they won't exist.
How much of a shoestring did you start on, Wendy?
What's that?
$3,000.
What was it?
He asked me what sort of a shoestring that I started on. I started with $3,000 that I'd raised from a best friend, an uncle, and a college journalism classmate.
Three. I keep telling everybody it was two.
Oh, well, see, it's up by a third. Yeah, underestimated by a third. So yeah, I was lucky enough to have credit cards that I lived off of for about a year until we were able to raise our first national grant, which was from the Surdno Foundation, that really believed in the idea of journalism as part of a functioning democracy. They got that, even though they don't traditionally fund news organizations. I want to offer a counter to the idea that there's not enough philanthropic support. There's not enough yet, right? I think we're still in the process of making the case to communities that have traditionally just either subscribed or not subscribed of our worth and our value and what it costs to do this kind of work and practice economic justice. There's money enough for everyone and for everything. And so I definitely don't want to position it as like the ballet or news. Although if I had to pick, probably would be news. But institutions across America find money for what they want to find money for. We've just got to make the argument that it needs to be news.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's definitely not either. And anytime we use the arts analogy, it's controversial because people sometimes think it's either or. That couldn't be farther from the case we're making, right? It's just not very big is the point.
Yeah, I think part of the dilemma is the idea of nonprofit journalism is new enough that for many people who might be generous about this, it never even crosses their mind that this is something that they could fund. I occasionally have to enter Cityside in certain databases for philanthropy, and they ask you, what category are you? And there is never a category for journalism. Never, ever, ever. It's community services or democracy or whatever.
Yes.
We should be our own category.
And well, and it is a growing. I mean, it's a growing space, right? You have institutions, the Institute for Nonprofit News Organizations, and others. So there is you could say, growing community of nonprofits. Is that a fair way? I mean, it seems you three all know each other, and I know that there are others. So is that the kind of thing that collectively, I guess, movements are being made to try and effectively change the philanthropic world? Come to our table.
Well, it's the only space in local news that's growing at all.
Yeah.
Is the nonprofit space. Everything else is shrinking, perplexingly quickly. And so now the challenge is it comes from a small base, which was for the most part only started 15 years ago, but from a growth rate standpoint, it's where all the growth is in local news.
Yeah, I think we're still at the stage where we're very successful at talking to each other, and we all know each other. I think there's still an enormous work of evangelism that needs to be done, and certainly on in our organization, we often talk about kind of our first task is to get people to recognize the crisis and that they can do something about it. And if some of that money then goes to us, that's great. But I'm equally happy. I had somebody write today saying, we're moving out of the area, so please cancel my recurring donation. I'm going to give to the news organization in the place I live now. And I wrote to him, I said, I think that's great. We need more people
Fantastic.
like you.
Yeah.
Just to piggyback off that a little bit, because, I mean, most people probably think, yes, nonprofit, news, one of the easiest ways I can get involved is money. But I'm curious, what, if any, are other ways that the public can or should be getting involved with your organizations?
Subscribe to our newsletters, read our sites, tell people about it, care about the news. I think those are all great ways to start.
Well, and I think engage with us in this discussion of the difference between commercial and civic intent, right? Because I mean, to Lance's earlier point, this is a category of philanthropy that's only about a generation old, which is kind of an eye blink in the grand spectrum of philanthropy. And a generation ago, newspapers were more concerned about being regulated as monopolies than they were about their existential sort of bona fides. And so just engaging in this discussion about public good, about public interest, about civic intent is almost bigger than money.
They can also feed us tips. We love tips.
Love it.
News tips.
As journalists, yes.
Absolutely. Well, so maybe playing off that on a different angle, how is nonprofit journalism dealing with general distrust with news, right? Like, the news industry has taken certainly some blows recently. How is nonprofit potentially approaching that issue of trust with the public differently? I mean, I'll pass it to Wendy first, if you can respond to that.
Yeah, I think it's what John said. I'm going to use this phrase, community cartilage. I've written that down. I think because we are beginning as a public good, that builds some trust inherently. You know, we're in communities, we're locally controlled, so there's not a Gannett or Alden steering Sinclair, calling the shots. Those editorial decisions are being made locally. And I think that we demonstrated in who we write for, and how we approach stories. I know that people here often, especially when we think about our bearing witness part of our mission, we really are writing the first draft of history and making sure that draft is complete and comprehensive. And people like seeing themselves, you know, online in our products. And I think that's some of the way that we build that trust. I also think that a lot of the distrust of the news focuses maybe more on a national level, and people don't see us as the media. Do you know what I mean? Like that's MLK 50. That's not NBC, CNN, Fox News. Yeah.
Yeah, I think if you look at the data, what Wendy just said is borne out. Local news is generally more trusted than national news. And it's really interesting that malevolent actors are exploiting that. You probably know, Dave, and certainly Wendy and John will be familiar with this. There's a wave of what are called pink slime local news sites, which are from dark money contributors. Most of them are on the right of the political spectrum, though there are, so-called progressive examples of this as well. But they've taken on this idea that if you're called, the Michigan, whatever, Clarion,
Yeah.
People say, oh, it's a local site for me as a Michigander, and it's slime, it's propaganda, it's they'll do some press releases so it looks like it's real, but what they're trying to feed you is constant junk from a local representative on their side of the issue. And part of our task, particularly in the sort of nonprofit journalism we're doing, is to fight against that wave as well.
I got one question, which is very specific. I'll pass it to you, Lance. Is it possible for small neighborhood for-profit papers to transition to nonprofits?
We did it.
Maybe not. Can you give us the short version?
Yeah,
of that?
short version is when we started Berkeley Side, almost identically the same time as Texas Tribune. We started as a for-profit. I tell people we were either a for-profit without the profits, or we were a non-profit without the tax advantages. And anyway, we realized our true identity. And 3 years ago, we decided the right path for us ahead was to convert. So we went through the process of converting. And it was pretty straightforward. There's a really good example, the Salt Lake Tribune, the major newspaper in Salt Lake City, converted from for-profit to nonprofit last year as well. So there aren't many examples of it, but people are doing it.
This is a question for John, but any of you can chime in. I think this person wants just a little bit more on why you think the commercial diverse model isn't viable. What is the problem with the commercial model as it stands right now? Why is it sort of to maybe exaggerate the question, doomed?
Sure. Well, I mean, the fundamental premise on which the local news business has been placed for 150 years is that a local newspaper is a really singularly good advertising delivery vehicle. It's the whole deal. Some have more subscribers than fewer. Some have other ancillary businesses, printing, whatever. But the real shtick was there is no there's no more effective vehicle than something that leverages place as the kind of organizing principle around renting an audience to retailers or commercial businesses. Along comes Facebook and Google. That logic gets turned completely on its head. And so newspapers become really crummy competitors at organizing audiences you can rent. And that happens over the course of a decade. And so kind of once you've got that problem, it kind of doesn't matter what your second biggest problem is. And that's what we've seen in newspapers over the last 20 years is they were kind of like, oh crap, we've got a problem. We're going to try to fix it by doing this, that, and the other thing. Your problem was so existential and fundamental that you're wasting your time if what you actually are trying to do is serve civic good as opposed to just keep the lights on commercially.
Okay. So another question, maybe again, tipping off of that, do you think that focusing, and again, this is open for anybody, do you think focusing on such specific topics and local issues actually restricts the growth of nonprofit? This person is asking about how does nonprofit journalism operate in a national or international sense?
Wendy and I are involved in local journalism. There are some fantastic nonprofit journalism organizations doing other things. Wendy mentioned she works with ProPublica, which really is doing more investigative journalism at all sorts of levels, on national issues, on local issues, on sectoral issues that are cross-cutting, doing extraordinary work. There's something like the Marshall Project, which is focused on criminal justice issues. There's Chalkbeat, which is focused on education. So you see a lot of different things. I mean, our interest, our choice has been to look at local news, but you can see some really good models pursuing either subject-based or regional or even national work too.
This is a question I'll pose it to Wendy, but again, would love for other folks to jump in, which is, do you think there are lessons that the commercial media can learn from you or from, again, local nonprofits? What do you think the larger journalism community or industry is learning from you, or should they learn from you?
I think they can and learn. They can and do learn a lot of things, including that it's possible to build racially diverse newsrooms and do great work. All of our newsroom leaders are women, and 3 of the 4 are women of color. So I think that they're watching us do that. I also think hopefully they're seeing the value of going deep and maybe not going as wide.
So one thing that, Lance, that you just kind of touched on is this idea of getting people excited about the news or interested in the news, which, again, some might say that has been a dwindling kind of vibe. And Lance and Wendy, I know your backgrounds in media and journalism, how you ended up here. I mean, John, I'm hoping maybe you can speak a little bit to how you got interested in this space. Like, what is it that you thought one day, oh, you know what, I'm going to start a very large nonprofit that covers the state of Texas, and then again from there, from the American Journalism Project. What was the magnet?
Yeah, that was not in the middle-aged male venture capitalist life plan. I can assure you that. How that got kicked off was I was serving as managing partner of our venture firm. We were reassessing our media investment strategy. This was about the time that the first distressed newspaper assets were coming on the market, and I got involved in a couple of 3 meetings where my conclusion was, holy cow, these are obviously terrible businesses that are going to get terribler. But what does that mean for everything that's going to get left out, everything that's in the interstices of the profit and loss statement? And so unfortunately, that's the one thing we've been really right about over the last 12 or 13 years is it's gotten worse faster. We didn't anticipate Twitter. We didn't anticipate the rapidity even of mobile. We didn't anticipate the takeover of these revenue streams by Google and Facebook. We just thought it looked kind of crappy on its face, and it's been worse. And so, whereas Lance is very diplomatic and saying we hope everybody works, I'm not. I'm just like, these things are gonna fail, and it's just a matter of how fast and how much are they going to take us down with them, because they're going to fail.
Okay, all right, and again, this is more of like a question. It's for Wendy. I mean, you mentioned, when you started, you had $3,000, which from where you are now, and I know a little bit of the story of MLK 50. I mean, that's like there's a novel in there, and we don't have time for that. But I am curious to know, like, what do you take out of that origin story, and if you were, what are the lessons of hindsight that other people should keep in mind as they maybe venture into this space?
Yeah, the hindsight is a book. Like, the origin story is a book, but the hindsight is a book too. It was probably not the best idea to start with so little fun because it's meant incredible personal sacrifice for me, that I don't think having the amount of available credit that I did should be the bar to start a newsroom. That just can't be how we bring people into this space. I think it would be important to start with a co-founder that's focused on the business side, right? I know journalism. I have run newsrooms. I can run a newsroom. There's a lot of things that I'm learning about the business side that it would have been better to have someone on board day one thinking about that as well. I think talent development is something that I never anticipated would take as much time as it has. And then I think the importance of relationships and tapping into networks. You mentioned the Institute for Nonprofit News. Lion, local independent online newsrooms, is another. Getting into cohorts like the one I'm with AJP or Emerson. Those are really important to have, those networks. So you can DM Lance and say, okay, this is what's going on. Help me figure this out. And so you're not reinventing the wheel, but you're really leaning on the community that we're building.
Yeah, we get, it's honestly every week someone is in touch with us, not just from the US, I mean, from all over the world, saying, I want to do something like this. And we're, together with my co-founders, we're generally very generous with giving time, and very often people, the first thing they say is, oh, trying to figure out how to do the journalism and things like that. And of course, you need to have a view of what kind of journalism you want to do, and a clear vision on that. But as Wendy said, you need to have at least someone starting out who actually is going to care about how are we going to make this sustainable, and how are we going to keep this going and fund it. The journalism, since most of the people that do this come from journalism, the journalism is the easy part. Figuring out how to pay for the journalism is the tough part.
And again, I'm not trying to put anybody on the spot, but that kind of does bring full circle back to you, John. In terms of what do you think are the tools or tricks or strategies that nonprofits are going to have to use and leverage in order to make this sustainable?
Well, to use Wendy, there's a book there too. I think the very short answer is nonprofits need to think about being nonprofit as a tax status and run themselves like a business as much as they can, but at the same time, think of themselves as civic institutions. And so what that means is management of these things has to be really good, right? Because to do all that in from one view is difficult, but that's what's being called upon, is the kind of psychic fabric or the emotional fabric, the psycho-emotional fabric to be public service, but the delivery mechanism to be no competitive commercially in a way that any venture-backed company would be. And so, as I said, that's not easy, but that's what we're asking folks like Lance and Wendy to do.
Is that, Lance and Wendy, is that difficult? I mean, like, yeah, I'm sort of hearing like almost a bipolar of, the civics, but also the, management side, which again, that business management side historically, as we, relied on advertising, and, someone in the comments mentioned that, local papers here, I don't remember the name, so I won't try and name them, are taking cigarette ads again. And, is that, I assume a local nonprofit wouldn't take cigarette ads maybe. So how do you thread that needle? You're trying to make this work, have the impact, but also, be able to have a roof over your head at the end of the day. How does this work?
Some choices are easy. We're not going to take cigarette ads. That's a really easy one. It's much tougher. One of the largest companies in the area we work in is Chevron, which is also one of the biggest despoilers of the earth. Should we take money from Chevron? I don't know what the answer. That's something we debate, so it isn't easy to be both mission driven and to have equity and democracy at the core of what you do, and to also be commercially minded. There sometimes are tough choices you have to make, but we've built up an organization, partly with the help, what AJP does is, John and the people at AJP aren't funding Wendy or my journalists. They're funding us hiring a development director, a head of sponsorship, a head of audience, all the things that will keep it sustainable. And if you get the right people and everyone is aligned around that mission, you can wrestle with some of those conflicts.
So there's a question for all three of you, which is, and this one I'm thinking specifically about the three of you and your projects that you told us about, which is, what should people know about your vision for the next, let's say, 12 months, right? From now in 12 months, what are you focusing on? Where do you hope to grow? Maybe we'll start with John, and then Wendy, and then Lance. John?
Sure. I don't know that there's anything all that evocative about the next 12 months. God knows the last 12 months have been quite something. But I think what we're focused on is really continuing to beat this drum that in every community there needs to be an organization which is a civic asset focused on the information and news needs of the community. And so we're just going to keep beating that drum this year, next year, year after.
Wendy?
Yeah, so when people ask me what my goal is, my long-term goal is world domination. If I
You're well on your way.
Hey.
As I frame it more diplomatically, it'll be dismantle the status quo where it's not in service of the most vulnerable people. And so we're going to continue to do that over the next year. We're going to be adding 3 new full-time people in the next couple of months. I'm looking at my calendar over here. And then we're hoping to add a full-time business side hire. We've been kind of cobbling that together with contractors and part of my time. We're going to get somebody on board that can be completely devoted to that. It's critical for our next stage of growth.
A year doesn't seem very long. 16 months ago, we were 8 people. We're now 22 people.
Wow.
We intend to keep growing. We think there's a real opportunity to do that. Particularly for the people in the room here, living and working in the Bay Area, we have this extraordinary situation where Memphis is, it's a big city, but there is a lot of poverty and a lot of inequity in a place like Memphis in particular. The Bay Area on the whole, although there's poverty and inequity for sure in the Bay Area is one of the wealthiest regions in the world. And yet even here, all around us, there are places that are virtual news deserts. And so over the next year, next few years, what we want to do is take what we've learned with Berkeley side, with the Oakland side, and do it in more places, provide our civic journalism to places that currently don't have any. And that's a really big challenge.
Yeah. We are coming close to an end here, and hopefully people have gotten an insight into, what you're doing and thinking. I want to give each of you one more opportunity just to sort of tell the audience that's here in person or online, what do you think is a key takeaway for them to understand about this space? Somebody who for the first time is thinking, oh yeah, maybe there's a local nonprofit solution to this, or what do you think is the key takeaway that they should go home and think about and mull over the weekend? And this time we'll actually go the reverse. So, actually, since you're here in person, maybe we'll end with you, Lance, if that's all right. Wendy, why don't you start? What do you think is a key takeaway for everybody?
I think it's a lot of what we've said before. To recognize news as a civic asset, to ask more of your journalism organizations, whether those for-profit media or nonprofit media in your market, to be smart news consumers. Understand that this is a relationship and a two-way relationship, that we want to hear from you and meet your information needs, and that particularly as nonprofit newsroom, that is our reason for being. Like John said, we're not here to make money, although we are going to be business minded, but that we need to fulfill our role as a public good.
Okay. And John?
Well, one thing that I've become fond of, and I wish I remember who had fed this to me because it's certainly not original, is that as a philanthropist, capital P or small p, whether it's as a foundation or you're trying to figure out where to give your charitable allocation at the end of the year, whatever your big deal is, if your big deal is education, if your big deal is climate or voting rights, I think we can make a really strong argument that your second biggest deal ought to be journalism. And that without sort of the common fact set that local journalism provides, it makes it a lot harder for you as a big P or small p philanthropist to do your work. And so that'd be my pitch.
And Lance?
I think what Wendy and John said is fantastic. I would just encourage people, find a nonprofit newsroom whose work connects with you and support them. It's very, very simple. John said, maybe you care about education, maybe you care about climate. Those are both areas where they're fantastic nonprofit newsrooms. So, if those are your concerns, give to GRIST, give to Inside Climate, give to Chalkbeat, give to EdSource. There are people doing great work in almost any area you can think of, as well as, obviously my passion is local. In the Bay Area, we're pretty big, but there, in our little world, we're pretty big, but there are smaller newsrooms in all sorts of places in Northern California doing really great work as nonprofit newsrooms. And so you'll find something.
Yeah, thank you. Those are all, I co-sign all three of those thoughts. And unfortunately, we are out of time, although we probably could have gone longer, but we've got several book ideas, so that's good. And I want to thank John Thornton, Wendy Thomas, Lance Noble. Thank you, all three of you, for bringing your time and expertise and your passion. I also want to thank the audience and everybody who is watching online. The video, all of this will be available as a video and a podcast on the club's website at www.commonwealthclub.org. And I am David Cohn, and this meeting of the Commonwealth Club is now adjourned. Thank you very much.